Hello, everyone, and thank you to all our delegates for joining Equality Leaders and our host partner, Bank of Ireland, at our Women's Summit today. It's my honour to be in conversation with Audrey, Melia, and Zara to speak about belonging, its absence, and what it means to each of them as women leaders. Our intention with this panel is to offer a platform to Pan-Asian women, along with allies, to amplify their voices. We'll be exploring topics such as the model minority myth, conditional inclusion, marginalization and allyship, as well as the commitments needed from organizational leaders to help build communities of belonging. I also want to acknowledge that the entire Pan-Asian community is not represented in its entirety here today. And so before we dive in, I think it's important for our esteemed panelists to share who they are and how they self-identify so that we're aware of our positionality and how it informs the conversation. For myself, my name is Tim, or T, and my pronouns are he, she, they. I self-identify as a genderqueer individual. I'm British, single father, and disabled, and I have the privilege of being non-exec director at Equality Leaders and learning from our panelists today. If I can pass over straight to Audrey, because you're on the top left of my screen, and ask you to pass the baton on.
Sure, thanks very much, Tim. So my name is Audrey. I'm from Malaysia myself, but I've been in Ireland since I was 16, and it's been 13 years already. Lived in Clare and now based in Dublin. I'm an Asian woman in my late 20s. I'm currently wearing a bright red top with glasses which have thin black frame, and I work in National Lottery. I'll pass it over to Zara. Sorry.
Hi there. I'm Zara So. I'm half Turkish, half Chinese, raised in Manchester and now living in horribly weathered London. I currently work as a film and TV assistant commissioner at the BBC, at Radio 1 specifically, and 1Xtra, having started my career as an A&R and record producer at Universal Music. I have curly hair and I'm wearing a grey sweater.
Love it. Love it. And I think we're just having a few technical difficulties with our third panelist, Melia. So we'll just pivot slightly with our first question. And Zara, I'd love to come straight to you with the grey sweater and the curly hair. Love all of that. We're talking, some of what we're talking about today is around code switching, sort of downplaying parts of your identity to make people feel comfortable. You've told us a little bit about your background and where you're at now. Could you tell us a little bit about how you've had to code switch in order to fit in?
I mean, I'm sure lots of the people listening in today, a lot of you might also be mixed race or living in a country that is different from when you were born, etc. So I think it might be useful just to outline the parameters. There's lots of jargon involved in race theory. So I might just outline the perimeter of race switching and like basically social switching and code switching. And it's essentially adjusting your own personal style, whether it's your speech, your behavior, or the way you express yourself in ways that facilitate and optimize the comfort of others in exchange for fair treatment. So I think that's the key part for me, the word in exchange for, or the term rather, because that's so integral, because it's a transactional behavior, and it's what I would classify as the conditional part of inclusion or exclusion. So there's a lot to unpick in what I just said. I think the main thing is that we need to have in mind is intersectionality. It's hard as a woman and a woman of color to work out what it is that makes someone discriminate against you. So there are so many forms of inequality and oppression that you might experience, whether it's that you're a woman, you're a person of color, you follow a certain religion, you have a disability. I won't go through the whole list as it's exhaustive and depressing, but it makes it extremely hard to pinpoint why it is that someone will treat you differently. So these systems of discrimination are interdependent, and also they overlap. So where does code switching come in? It sometimes feels like it's the only way you can alleviate some of the many reasons why you might be treated differently. So I'm certainly not guilty, but responsible for, trying to compensate for my appearance. That's something I can't change. I am obviously either an Asian woman or not a white woman. So I find other ways to find common ground. And sometimes that's dropping my northern accent. I'm originally from Manchester. It's smiling more because you want to seem less threatening, or it's softening my stance in a debate because I want to seem less confrontational. Remaining calm at microaggressions because I want to seem less emotional. So all of these things come into play on a daily basis, I'd say. And, a couple of examples is when I was 19, I applied for a job at a famous jewelry brand. I won't name them. And they told me, I swatted up for it. I made sure I knew everything. They told me that I got the job, but on the condition that I straightened my hair because my hair seemed too messy. I have very coarse hair, and I have very curly hair. And for example, in a meeting the other day, someone was talking about a mathematical problem. And I said, oh, I'm Asian. I should be good at that. So I basically microaggressed myself. But the reason we do that is because we preempt other people doing it, and it's much less hurtful. So yeah, I've gone on a bit, but this is my day-to-day code switching, which I think many women of color will experience.
Thank you, Zara. I mean, you've given a lot of personal examples in there, which I think a lot of people will resonate with, even if they aren't Pan-Asian women. But staying on the topic of Pan-Asian women and code switching, Audrey, Milja, do you have any experience with the code switching that mirrors Zara's own experiences there?
Yeah, like when Zara mentioned accent, I think that's probably the first thing that came to mind. Those who are close to me know that I have several accents, depending on who I speak to. I think that was the one thing that I really actively tried to change when I first came to Ireland. Like when I first came here, I sounded very typically Malaysian, and my classmates didn't understand me despite the English, or my teachers didn't get me either, just from the accent. So I knew that I had to change. And it took about a year of like active changing my accent until I got it. But now I have a switch that, if I'm with my friends or with my family or with colleagues, but also if the colleagues are from Ireland, they hear the Irish accent. And then if my colleagues are from America, it might change a little bit. So I think it's something we don't realize how important that is, because you're perceived very differently based on how you sound.
Hello, everyone. Apologies for all the technical issues. Despite all good intentions and 15 minutes early dial-in, of course, it fails us. Code switching is quite an interesting topic. I mean, in and of itself, code switching isn't a negative thing, right? We do it frequently in unharmful, if you will, contexts, right? So, for example, when we speak to children, we change our language, we change our tone of voice, maybe even our physical stance. And I suppose where code switching does get a bit more challenging is when a number of things happens. One is when it's forced upon us, because not doing so implies that we can't fit into the norm. And what it does is it sort of perpetuates this culture where we feel like we have to actually follow that norm. But I too, listening to some of your stories, Zara and Audrey, I mean, I too have code switched many times. So I was born in Korea, raised in the US, and I've lived in the UK for over 20 years. And probably before I was even conscious of what I was doing at a very young age, I was a bit like you, Audrey. I speak, different accents, different languages, having moved to the US and such. And I think that's part of naturally who we are in trying to communicate. The challenge really is around, I suppose, when we think that a society imposes that code switching, and therefore it creates this sort of collective loss of authenticity, I would say, for those who have to code switch.
No, that's really insightful, Milja. Thank you for sharing that. And I want to stay with you for a moment. We spoke about in the beginning some of the topics that we're looking to cover in this session, and one of them, of course, being around the model minority myth. Sort of building on what you were talking about there around sort of the roots of how we code switch for children and how we sort of adjust ourselves to different scenarios. Can you tell us a bit more about the model minority myth. What is it, and perhaps how it's impacted your journey as a woman leader?
Yes, I have so many thoughts on the model minority myth, as do many people. I mean, ultimately, it's about this perception that those of a certain minority group have a higher or different level of achievement, and sometimes that more broadly is characterized around socioeconomic standing. And at times it's quite harmless. In fact, it's often not meant for malice, right? It can be sort of born from compliment. I think Zara was sort of alluding to it as I was logging on, but this idea that you can be good at math and such because you're Asian and such. But there are some challenges with it, because ultimately what it does is it excludes, because it implies that other minority groups don't have that same level of achievement and therefore aren't as valued. It implies that those within the minority groups who don't fit those characteristics are also not as valued. And in essence, what it does is it creates a class structure around perceived excellence, and one that's centered around ethnicity. So I do have a challenge with that, even though we've heard all these comments and have had these thoughts ourselves. I mean, for me, it's hard to say exactly what the effect of all that has been on my personal journey, because as with many people, I am a product of multiple lived experiences. And presumably, I've landed on the right side of that myth. Depends who you talk to. But it could easily have gone the other way. And I've seen this time and time again in my career, and also in my personal relationships, where people who've fallen on all of those sides that I've mentioned have actually gone the other way. And I think ultimately, anything that excludes rather than includes isn't a necessary thing, no matter what the actual sort of rationale behind it might be.
I love that. Anything which excludes rather than includes isn't a necessary thing. Gosh, ones to take away today. Audrey, Zara, can you resonate with some of what Millie said there? Is there any sort of synergy in your own stories?
Yeah, I mean, I've probably experienced it in a slightly more insidious manner, in that there are very few Asian women in the arts. I work in the arts, I work in media. And I honestly think it helps perpetuate this sort of, the model minority myth perpetuates this imposter syndrome that we all experience. I do think women of color experience it more, because there are lots of preconceived notions about you, and like the pressure of being the token Asian can also be quite stifling. It's difficult when you don't see people who look like you in an industry that you're moving into. And I think that's what perpetuates this panic. So I do think it's been quite an unhealthy strand in my life and in the life of some people I know, for that reason.
Yeah, I would support exactly what Zara said there. Like, for the past 6-7 years of working, I have the expectation that I will not see someone like me around me, and that's just the baseline. And when I do see someone that looks like me, I'm like, oh, there's another one. And I think I unconsciously brought that with me when I first started working, thinking that the people around me, the first time, it might be their very first time working with somebody that looks like me. So I need to make sure that they have a good impression of people that look like me, so that I set a good bar for anyone else that they work with in the future. And I think some of my managers picked up on that as I went through my career, saying that, Audrey, I think you're putting a lot on yourself. You're always expecting too much of yourself on certain times. And I think I've gotten to more grips with that now, knowing that I may be a role model, but it's good to role model balance, showing that you shouldn't feel that pressure to be a certain way.
I love that. And staying with you, Audrey, talking about putting a lot of pressure on yourself and the expectations. Let's talk a little bit about some of the expectations of others, particularly allies, and what part they can play in dismantling some of these more harmful myths and narratives and exclusionary practices. What are your expectations of allies?
I've actually had very positive experiences with my colleagues who have been allies to me, probably not even consciously. You know, I think they might not even understand the word ally at that time, but they certainly were. I think the expectations are not actually large. It's just really basic supportive things that colleagues should do to all colleagues regardless. I've had times where colleagues have spoken up for me when I felt I couldn't speak up for myself. I've had experiences where, you know, somebody might have said something like, "Oh, your approach is really sad," or like, "That's really weird that you're doing it a certain way." And someone else then spoke up saying like, "No, it's just a different opinion. There's nothing wrong with being different." And those small comments made a huge impact on me and my confidence to be who I am now. That extended to even things like food that I felt comfortable to bring to work. I'd say the first few years, I would bring certain things to work and I wouldn't bring certain things to work just from the worry about comments in the kitchen over lunch. Or clothes. You know, I tried to make sure I looked like everyone else. Don't stand out too much. You know, what's normal fashion in this area? Whereas now I feel like because of the comments I've heard from my friends and colleagues at work, they very much have encouraged me to just be myself.
So it sounds like there's some great lessons around affirmation as well, what people can do to sort of bring you into feeling comfortable as part of allyship. Zara and Amelia, what would you say is important to you in allyship beyond perhaps what Audrey has outlined there, or double clicking on some of the things which she said?
I think that in my personal experience, people have often meant well. And, you know, as I said, I work in media and I do a lot in film and television as well. And I have been seeing people making an increased effort. I think it's okay to, I think what puts people or scares people from demonstrative allyship is the fear of getting it wrong. And the fact of the matter is people do get it wrong. I've got it. You know, I've done these talks before and been like, I used the wrong word there, meant something completely different. You know, we often do get things wrong, but I think it's the open conversation. And I think you shouldn't expect the person of color to necessarily educate everyone around them as well. I think a lot of it is picking up some of that emotional burden as someone who is, you know, is potentially, you know, white, or I think a lot of it comes into that as well. Like, we take a lot of the trauma of the daily explanations of why something should be, you know, people often say the word colorblind casting to me, for example, when I work in film and TV. It's a phrase I hate. It's a phrase I really, really hate, because I think colorblind is an eraser of identity, as opposed to like something that encourages. But we just have to take into consideration that people have different approaches. It's such a personal thing.
And I would echo a couple of things that Audrey and Zara said. I think, firstly, like Audrey, I felt quite fortunate to have had many allies in my past, even before that word meant what it does today. And they were always organic, right? Usually the ones that get assigned to you at work and such. Those aren't the relationships that work. It's the ones where people actually want to have that conversation, where it does work. I think, you know, from my perspective, I would say, you know, the terrain around diversity has changed so much, even in the last couple of years. It is quite difficult to navigate. And from my perspective, what I ask of allies is be present, ask questions, be a human being. And despite, as you say, Zara, the burden of our having to sort of educate people, there is a bit of that, right? We have to make it a safe place for allies and others, future allies, to be able to do all three of those things: be present, ask questions, and such. And we ourselves are allies in some fashion, or most of us might be. I mean, unless we had the privilege of being of belonging to every single definition of diversity there is. We are all allies in some sense. And I think we need to be quite mindful that we have that same burden, which isn't fair. I know it isn't. It's what you say, Zara. We had that extraordinary sort of additional bit, whether it's what you said, Audrey, earlier about having to sort of be that model because we hold that sort of the shoulders of everyone else around us. But equally so, that terrain is changing so quickly that it's quite hard for us unless we are all pulling perhaps even a little bit more of our weight than we really want to make that happen. And I think allies come in two forms, by the way. There are those who are express allies. They are out there marching the march, speaking in venues like this. And there are those who just day to day do it because it's the right thing. And I think we need to be conscious about helping each of those succeed, because only then can we actually get that equation around diversity right.
Well, I'm taking lots of notes as I'm listening, and the three things that I've taken so far are around, allyship being around affirmation. Audrey, your words there, and Amelia talking about curiosity and presence, and Zara around intent and impact and that safety. And Zara, I want to stay with you for a moment around, we've spoken a little bit around how the landscape of DEI has shifted, maybe how belonging in general has shifted. So what does belonging mean to you? And how are you growing communities of belonging as a leader and as a woman?
This question, I was thinking about this for a while, and I think back onto the comments about how things are always in flux, and it's a great thing because there's so much social change that goes on all the time. Over the past few years in particular, companies have rushed to implement these diversity programs, which is fantastic. And I said the burden, and the reason I use the word burden, I think, is because the act of educating carries a heavy emotional price tag for many of us. And I've noticed that these initiatives unduly fall on employees of color, in particular, Asian women, also Black men and Black women. We're often the ones who are wheeled out to talk about these sorts of things to a company. And I have a lot of non-white friends and also queer friends who come to me and say, "Oh, I've been asked to run another seminar and talk to the company about this and that." And none of them work in HR, so it's not like a natural progression of their work. So they then ask themselves the questions: how do we manage our increased workload and take on these new tasks? Will we face repercussions for speaking the truth, because sometimes the truth is very, very ugly? Will they let down their colleagues of color if they don't step up to the task? Will their colleagues blame them if the company doesn't follow through? There are all these questions which come in addition to basically us running these seminars and running these meetings. And although it's great to have a platform, and I'm very, very grateful for a platform, I think it's wrong to assume that just because someone identifies as a person of color, they're interested or qualified in talking about equality or diversity and inclusion. So I think with regards to growing communities, as much as I like to take the responsibility on myself, because I enjoy the didactic process and the nurturing process of it, I think a lot of it has to be done wider than the people. That I think companies need to maybe dig a little deeper in order to find the best way to educate people on this, rather than using their own colleagues. I don't know, Audrey, Amelia, you might have a slightly differing opinion on that.
No, I think what you said there is really right, and I'm very much in that space in my workplace. So I lead on diversity and staff engagement in general. So I'm the one that has to put together that program for all things diversity and how do we get our company involved. And I'm always very conscious that just because you're part of that diversity group doesn't mean you want to be the spokesperson. So my approach normally is get an external expert on that topic. I reach out to lots of the nonprofit organizations based in Ireland to come speak to us. If, for example, we had the National Women's Council with us on this Monday around Women's Day, but then also a panel of our internal speakers but I'd approach many different people, give them the exact questions that we're going to ask them, and give them a week or 2 to 3 to reflect on, do I want to take part in this? And if you want to say no, absolutely fine. You don't have to speak. And that's kind of the approach I've taken. So to make sure that those who want to get involved can, and those who don't feel comfortable, don't feel pressured. And if I'm ever unsure of what to do, I try to look for experts in the region in Ireland.
I think what you're both saying is actually quite interesting, because it speaks to what the ecosystem of belonging and fostering that community looks like. And you both talked about the workplace specifically, but it can go certainly outside of that. And I mean, ultimately, what we're trying to do, what is belonging, right? It's this idea that despite differences, ultimately we are valued for who we are. And how do we make that happen across all levels? And when I think about sort of the way I've been doing it, I suppose, is as a non-executive director, I sit on a number of boards. My view is I want to make a pervasive impact around many things: diversity, not just women, not just ethnicity, but and in doing that, a couple of things. One is, sitting on boards, I have an opportunity to influence a variety of companies and how they think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But equally, sort of from a personal perspective, I do things that are much more grassroots. And so I'm a mentor. I do a lot of public speaking, as you all do, but I also connect people to each other. I spend a lot of time doing that. And I know sometimes it feels like, 1 in, 2 out, and it sort of feels backwards sometimes. But actually, if we see that sort of the wave of change and how it's happened over the past couple of years, this is the time now to be thinking about how to grow those communities. And I share this view that it isn't right for everyone, and everyone's model of how they do it will be quite different, because we each have our own tolerances of what we want to take on as that burden, and the word that you use, Sarah. Also the sphere of influences that we might have, and how creative or diligent or different, or whatever adjective you want to put in front of there, I think will influence that. But I do think there's still more opportunities for growing those communities. And certainly anybody out there who's watching today, if they have any thoughts, I'm sure all of us would welcome that, because I think there's just not enough ways for us to connect. And we know that once we get that networking effect going, it becomes this wonderful sort of virtuous, I don't know, spiral or spider web, whatever shape you want to attribute to it. But anyway.
Do you know, it's joyful that we're hearing all of this. I'm only sad we've only got so much time, because I could listen to you for ages. Because one of the next questions we're coming to is sort of around what we can do next as organizations. And I think some of the things you've just touched on around making sure that there's, say, a local relevance, there's an interest, there's an expertise behind what's driving the change, as well as that connection to community. But what is it that we need to do? What are those actionable steps towards driving a more sort of inclusive and diverse organization going forward? What needs to happen?
I mean, that's the $1 million question. That's $1 million. I think it goes back to what we touched on a tiny bit, and I've seen someone's written a question about this actually, about how it's not necessarily the fear of getting it wrong, but it's the consequences of getting it wrong. And I totally understand. I totally understand, like, the fear, because we all come from very, very different backgrounds, and I'm not saying that's an excuse necessarily, but it's perhaps one of the reasons why our terminology isn't quite right, or it's outdated. Terminology, as we said, changes so quickly. I think a lot of it is companies or communities not being reactive necessarily. So every time there's a devastating, traumatic event in an Asian community, it's not having a chat. I think it's having up-to-date training. I think a lot of that is probably just, a lot of that will maybe reduce some of the fear that people feel about talking about it. Because, we're all, as we said, we all get it wrong, and we're all scared of getting it wrong, because we have seen examples of it in the press, of people getting it wrong and being persecuted, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think in day-to-day events, when people do get it wrong, it's knowing how to, when you feel like you've got something wrong, or someone tells you you've got something wrong, what are the next steps that you need to take as a person in order to rectify it, or in order to not let it spiral. So I think a lot of it is just like up to date, and having an actual process of doing it.
And I think a good way of staying up to date, just following up on Zara, is knowing who your people are in your business, because what's relevant to your business might not be the exact same as the business next door. So like it's challenging, but for us, we've started to try and ask our staff about their own diversity, giving them the platform to voluntarily share with us, based on the 9 grounds in Ireland. Where do you belong under those categories? And if you'd like to share with us, at least we get a better understanding of what will be relevant to you. And then we can organize initiatives that you might connect with, or you might want to learn. Maybe there's a lot of parents in the company, and you want to learn things that be relevant in that way. And then just looking at the chat, Amanda asked, how do we make sure that it's not an extracurricular initiative? It's not easy, but if you can get senior leadership buy-in, I think that's key. And when you see your CEO present at your D&I events, when you see the whole senior team there and asking their teams to come along to those initiatives, then it might not be seen as extracurricular. That, if you have the hour, pop by, but it's not easy.
I'd have to agree with you on that, Audrey. I mean, senior sponsorship is so important, because ultimately the culture of an organization, that could be a commercial organization, it could be a government, but whatever entity we're talking about, I think the culture and that messaging from the top is incredibly important. Otherwise, it just won't stand the test of time. And it's interesting, because I think thinking about Tim, your question is such a challenging one, and that's possibly an indication of why people don't always know where to start. But just thinking about some of the things that could help foster belonging in a workplace, I'll call it the HR process, but it's so much more than that. But everything from even pre-recruiting to onboarding, to development, to assessments, even to the exit, and thinking about that entire chain of the life cycle of an employee, and how we could change the processes, as you mentioned, Zara, certainly the culture, but but that, just taking it from that perspective, I think is the way a lot of companies are going, because it seems to be the natural link to people. It shouldn't be the only one, by the way, but it feels like at least some sort of grounding to kickstart that.
And it sounds as if there's a mix between how we really identify some of those key pain points from an inclusion perspective, and really start to unpick what some of those root causes for those inequalities and those inequities are. One of those points, which was raised earlier on by Ian Beckett, he thanks all of you for sharing some of your excellent examples of code switching, and gives a question. He says, as a manager, I code switch when dealing with different global teams in order to make myself better understood. When you see a manager doing this, does it work towards effective communication, or do you feel offended?
I mean, Melia, you touched on this earlier. We all do it. We all code switch. It's quite a general term. I think we all alter our behavior. We don't act the same way at work as we do with I hope not anyway, as we do with our friends. When you see a manager alter, I don't think anyone is necessarily offended by it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Melia and Audrey. In that, I think it's an important thing to see other people doing it too. I think the code switching we specifically are talking about is even more specific to also being a woman in the workplace. The smiling, the not coming across as being confrontational. That's what makes it difficult. It's really hard to pinpoint these small. They're not big changes. They're small. And that's what makes them slightly more dangerous, the fact that they're so granular that they become part of our personalities. So I don't necessarily think I've ever seen anyone else do it. And I've said, I've ever taken it in a bad way. I've taken it in a, thank God we all do this. I just think women and women of color do it in a slightly different way, to please the person across from them a bit more.
I think trying to account for cultural, geographic culture, rather than sort of corporate culture, but sort of cultural differences, isn't necessarily a bad thing. And we do all do it. And I've worked across more than 40 countries, and I certainly have intentionally, because there are certain norms that work in one country that don't work in others. And to me, that's not necessarily code switching. That is actually, I suppose technically it might be, but you know, from my perspective, that's more about trying to work within the boundaries of a particular culture when you are not necessarily the one who has to be different for that particular situation, if that makes sense. I think it all goes to intention as well, to Ian, who asked this question. It's so difficult because intention is a matter of interpretation. My personal view is I rarely get offended unless I think someone is intending to say or do something of harm. And then I think to myself, is this possibly a teaching moment? Is this possibly a moment where I just let it go, whatever it might be? But it's only when I think someone is trying to actually do harm that I get offended. But I'm not. But not everyone is like me or the rest of us. So it is a very tough question to answer, Ian, because it's really situational. My personal view is it's not a terrible thing if it feels authentic to who you are and not exaggerated, perhaps.
Yeah, and potentially to build on that, I think with the intention is when you code switch, you know, from A to B, what is that code switch based on? Is it based on past interactions with this individual, or is it based on an assumption before you know that person actually needs that code switch? Just as a very simple example, when I first came to Ireland, I realized people were speaking slower to me, potentially thinking that English wasn't my first language. And I got compliments for my English from teachers. And then when I explained to them that, like, actually English is my native language, then they were like, oh. So that kind of thing made me feel a bit like, ugh, because I knew it was an assumption. But if it was something that you know, this code switch is actually going to be a beneficial thing between the two of you and you have a good relationship, then absolutely.
That's a fascinating. Oh, go ahead,
Sorry,
Zara.
well, I was just going to pinpoint it specifically back to what I said about intersectionality and leading on from what Audrey was saying. Like, there are times when it's very much welcome. You know, when there are members of the team who are neurodivergent, and you alter the, you know, it's a lot of it's collaboration. I think not much can go wrong through a collaborative conversation with the person that you're potentially code switching with, because I think if you outline both parties outline the different needs that they have, you can come to some sort of an understanding about what it is the person needs and act in that way. So, you know, with the example of neurodivergence, I think there are many things that we can do to be more inclusive in that code switching.
And I think, you know, it sounds like we've got the topic for a future discussion here, you know, code switching or cultural intelligence, you know, and how far is it welcome? You know, it's a fascinating question. I think we could spend a long time on. And we have a few questions coming in, and Audrey, you touched a little bit on this one already, which was around how can we make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace aren't extracurricular or add-on. I'd love to sort of ban that around the virtual table again, because I'm sure there's different perspectives on how we can effectively integrate DEI. I don't know who wants to maybe take the start. Maybe Zara, could I come to you to begin with?
So in terms of DEI.
Yeah, so how do we get to a place where DEI in the workplace isn't extracurricular, so we can really get it integrated?
So I think the reason why it feels extracurricular to many of us is because it is a reactive thing. It's something that comes out of something. So it's a reaction to, you know, when everyone, those horrible series of shootings in the US, for example. And that's when I received, you know, a seminar to talking through Asian trauma and things like that. I think that's when it becomes slightly extracurricular, because often the people who attend those are Asian, and you notice that there aren't many non community people attending those, which is why to me it feels token, because we already know, and although it's nice coming into a circle and feeling like you're in a community, I think a lot of it is that we need to build allies. So I think by making it grassroots within an organization, and who knows where the grassroots start, honestly, like is it that you hire more execs who reflect the community that you're trying to build? Is it that your hiring process changes? Is it that you work through your intrinsic biases? I don't have the answer to that, but it needs to go deeper than just like seminars, I think.
Audrey, would you, apologies, Melia, would you like to build on that point from Zara?
Yes, actually, I fully agree with Zara on many points. Maybe I'll take a slightly different tact. So oftentimes people think of DEI as this sort of soft, fluffy thing, as you say, Zara, sometimes reactive to the rather unfortunate instances that have happened in the past couple of years, particularly in the US. And so one way of possibly making a bit more integrated or a bit more of a burning platform is to put some data and some facts behind what's happening. I think, whether it be as something as simple as surveys or just really getting to the heart of, figuring out getting people to self-identify, figuring out who is of a certain diverse group, what their issues are and such, but getting some of that to create that really unassailable set of facts that CEOs and everyone else who should be sponsoring this can't miss, I think is one way of addressing it amongst many.
I don't know if it's a generational thing as well. And I know that's a dangerous thing to go into, and I won't go into it too much because, but I do think the younger generations, it's a lot of it's also adjusting to the way younger generations react to things. I mean, with social media and with TikTok, etc., the way that information is digested is so different that I do think that the way that it is taught isn't a catch-all. You have to, I'm not saying we should dedicate, half of the workday to talking about the Pan-Asian experience, but there needs to be more bespoke tailoring to the industry that you're also working in. You can't just like hire a consultant who primarily does, finance, because the world of finance is so different from the world of media and arts. It needs to be a bit more of a bespoke education. I do think, you do get it wrong. What we were saying earlier is it's okay to get it wrong. But at the same time, it's not okay to not educate yourself afterwards. I think that's one thing that I regret not adding what we said earlier. It's not okay to carry on, as ignorance is also not a healthy attitude. So yeah, I do think I think all in all, it's a generational thing as well.
I think I might
no, thank you for sharing that.
Sorry.
No, Audrey, you're doing exactly the right thing. Absolutely. Please do. I was just going to come to you.
The extracurricular bit, it's something I think all companies do struggle with. And one thing that I'm trying to do now is look at all the normal business processes throughout the company and trying to put a diversity lens on them. So kind of pulling on to where Melia was saying, the whole employee journey, from the application process to the induction to meeting your manager, and making sure that all the different touch points has been reviewed and all the relevant policies have also been reviewed with a diversity lens. So currently we're kind of literally looking at every single policy we have in the business. And yes, we have our DEI policy and it's there, but looking at every other policy we have and making sure we've looked at it with a D&I lens on to see if we can improve any of the way we do things, the policies, the practices, so that it gets embedded in the business, because those processes happen anyway. And making sure that any of the people involved in any of those processes are equipped with the knowledge that's relevant to that section as well. So, for example, we had a management training today about leading people, and we made sure that we included leading inclusive teams as part of it, rather than having, here's another D&I training that everyone has to attend, trying to niche it in existing things already, so it doesn't feel like an add-on.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think part of what I'm hearing here is around, the need to integrate, the need to be clear about intent, and you're challenging my thinking, so I very much welcome this. My notebook is somewhat smoking at the moment. I suppose a question that I have personally for you, we talk about growing our communities of belonging. That we know that a lot of different organizations do it perhaps in different ways, whether it's belonging groups or using membership organizations externally. What's the role that you think some of those organizations play or those groups play? How would you like to see growth happening in building belonging and sense of community? Do you see it as something that should happen naturally, or something which in some ways is commoditized?
I think if we wait for things to happen naturally, we'll be waiting for a very long time. There needs to be some agency. There needs to be some active movement. I don't know if you all agree with me on that, but things like the question I get asked a lot is how helpful is, when in the hiring process, how helpful is it to have a policy where you have to hire X number of people from a certain community? And again, it's a really tricky question. But if we don't have, due to a number of things, and we can go back to colonialism if we want to, but due to a number of factors, there is people of color are disadvantaged in the workplace, in that, fewer people are being hired across most industries. Melia, Audrey, I don't know if it's the same with yours. But there's a disproportionate number of Asians in my industry in particular. So I do think something active needs to be done to make up for the institutionalized disadvantage that Asian people and Asian women have had.
I'll have to agree with you, Zara, and I'm going to paraphrase one of Newton's laws of motion. A body in motion will just keep going a certain way until a force acts on it. That's my sort of layman's way of talking about it. I'm not a physicist. But I think we've had centuries, millennia of what we have. Why would we think that it would change if we don't have forces of change around it? And it's not enough to have a few, or more than a few, sadly, incidents that put some fire under our feet. We also need everyone in that ecosystem we talked about earlier to work on this. And I'm a big sort of proponent of people influencing policy and process and thinking, because otherwise, especially in something as tricky as this conversation, it's very difficult for people to be in their silos and sort of come to a great conclusion, unless it's an iterative process. It's a very collective process, in my view.
Yeah. And I think when we want to instigate that change, I think it's really important on how we do it, because it's when you have that perspective, it's very easy for us to understand, like, obviously this is the right thing to do, but there are many other people we need to bring along that journey with us. And I think it's really important that we put ourselves in their shoes. Like, what would they think of this initiative when we launch it? Making sure that we bring them with us and help them to see the rationale behind it, so that they too can believe in it. Because if you do it in too harsh of a way, it could create a divide. And that's one thing I'm always very conscious of at work, and that you don't want to put one group above the other. It's more of collectively bringing inclusion for everybody with you. The only thing is sometimes you wish it was a bit faster, but to have a bit of patience and just hearing feedback from people around you and asking for feedback too, across the initiatives that you might do or events, etc.
I'm with you on the wishing things were fast a bit, for sure. I'm not so good at the patience, so I'll learn from you on that. I guess one of the things which I want to double click on, recently I was at an event where we were talking about the importance of being a good future ancestor and sort of a recognition that this work will take a long time. You know, being a good ancestor for generations to come. You know, this work probably will take a long time, sadly. But what is it in your view? You know, there's a sense of agency that needs to happen around this work. What are the one or two things, if we had to prioritize, what would be the one or two things that you think we should put particular agency around?
I think if you can, mentoring, because that's a generational thing, right? It's the way you can touch the like society and the lives of someone who lives in a very different situation from you, and it's recognizing that there are going to be lots of people who do that. So Mila, you said you do a bit of mentoring, and you know, I work with people with who don't have access to education from all communities. I think that's probably the most important thing. It's if you are able to. I think I'll stress that not everyone is able to, and not everyone wants to, which is absolutely fine. But if you have the time, if you have the ability, or you know, if you are looking for an initiative in your workplace, maybe really push the fact that we should be reaching out to other people, particularly younger people.
For me, first of all, Tim, there's not only one or two things, but I'll pick one just to humor us all. I think it's whatever programs in place we can put in place to break the structural challenges in getting people into and up in the workplace. And I know that there's a lot of that happening at the senior levels, especially at the board level, and it's starting to be addressed at the executive level, which is great. It's happening from a gender perspective, and it's happening from an ethnicity perspective. And I'm hoping that it will just carry on through other diversity as well. But until we do that, we all know that work and economics is a form of power, whether we like to admit it or not. And until you fix that, we cannot fix that imbalance in power that there is right now.
I think to build on Zara's mentoring piece, the whole point is that you get a different perspective, right? You get a different perspective of someone who might be going through something that you don't understand. And I think a simple thing that anyone who works in a business can take away is, you know, when you finish this webinar and you go back to your workplace, just look around you, look at your team, look at the people you work with, and see if there's someone who's slightly different to you in any way. And go for a coffee and just have a chat on what's work like to you, what are your challenges, and just open your perspectives a bit more. I think if every one of us did that for any kind of group, any marginalized group in your company, within the year, you learn way more than you ever did before about someone else's perspectives. And that could help bring collective empathy and change to how things are in your workplace.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind, I'm going to take a tiny bit of a backseat position there and just ask Amelia something about what you said earlier as well, about economics and what was it, economics and work being power. I don't want to paraphrase you incorrectly. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a pretty good paraphrasing of what I said. Yeah.
How I'm going to ask a question, apologies. But how is it then that, you know, if you are in a position where you are not high up in a position of great economic, in a great economical position, or a great, I'm not going to say social, but a great work-life position, what are the ways you can do as a woman of color, as an Asian woman, or as a Pan-Asian, to try and increase your power? It's sounding very Succession. Apologies. I just want to know, because I'm sure lots of people will be feeling that as well.
Yeah, it's quite a difficult position, isn't it? I mean, there's two parts to the equation. There are the allies who already have the influence in the areas that we talk about, and they are a very important part of this equation. Without them, I don't think we could move as fast as we have so far, acknowledging that we haven't moved very quickly. I think for us, it's a culmination of a lot of things that we talked about on this in this session, right? It's fostering those communities so that people can be heard and we can create more equality. Because I think, it's one thing to sort of create programs and talk about this on pieces of paper and on billboards and whatever, social media and so forth. I just aged myself by calling it billboards, by the way, but social media and so forth. But it's another for it to be felt by everyone, not just those who are diverse groups. And to be felt, one of the few things have to happen. Either there has to be some sort of event, I don't know, a wedding or a terrible event, as we've discussed earlier, or the passage of time where it becomes accepted. And I'm afraid that the second part isn't the part that we actually want to be focusing on, because that could take forever. Although it does happen. I mean, look at the much more widespread acceptance of gay marriage and things like that. It's taken, a very long time for that to happen. And so I think that growing, this whole session around growing communities of belonging is incredibly important. And if we can find ways to do that more, that's actually how you get that grassroots and top down being felt. What I don't, and I think what might have been the genesis of your questions are, what I don't think necessarily works is from my perspective anyway, is pounding the table in the wrong situations. Because actually what you do is then you actually sort of go backwards, I think, what we're trying to achieve. And it's so situational. For me to sort of give you a rule of thumb is pretty impossible at the moment. But I think sort of the last thing, just to answer your question, is for those of us who are, and I suspect everyone on this call, or most everyone on this call are, but for those of us who are of a diverse nature, we have to support each other. It's more than just belonging in community, but it's this whole sort of higher purpose. What you say, Tim, around being a great future ancestor. It's a perfect way of phrasing it. I don't have children, for example, but I do what I do because I want others around me, whether it's my nephews and nieces, but just even faceless sort of, the faceless future, to not have to go through what we went through. And I think that kind of sense of purpose, which not everyone has, I recognize, it's quite important, and it will serve you quite well.
I mean, gosh, I could probably just listen to all of you all day. I mean, sadly, we are sort of coming towards our close. And, Audrey, I'm taking something away from you in particular around coffee and curiosity. You should trademark that, definitely. Before we do sort of round up to close, I would love to hear from each of you. What one key takeaway or call to action or question would you give our audience today?
I'll go first. I think for a long time I was waiting for someone to do something at the start of my career, like somebody else to speak up. So what I'm going to leave you with is stop waiting. If you are waiting for someone to speak up yourself, and lead whatever you have in your head to lead, regardless of what role you have in your company.
So actually, I would say mine's not that different than what you just said, Audrey. So when it comes to belonging, be a purveyor, not just a participant.
I guess I want to end it on a positive note, but I can't. I was like, what do I say that doesn't make me sound really cynical? Because I'm truly not. I think the main takeaway, something that's changed in me quite recently, and I'm ready to change my mind again probably, but it's not taking offense if it's not intended. I think that goes back into what you were saying, Melia, as well, and Audrey. I think from both parties as well, but particularly if someone tells you this makes me uncomfortable, or I felt slightly strange about this, I think it's the lean back listening and just digesting and not making it into am I a racist kind of conversation. I think a lot of it is just sitting, having these conversations and knowing that no one should be attacking you for something if it was not intended in a certain way. I think that is the thing that scares most people from talking about race, and by consequence, handling some of the issues. So yeah, I think just a neutral, having those structures in your workplace that allow people to talk about things in a constructive way.
Absolutely. And 3 powerful stories, 3 powerful summaries, and on behalf of Equality Leaders, all our audience and myself. Thank you, Audrey, Nelia, Zara, for your stories and your advice and your time. All of you, absolute inspiration. So thank you again. We are now moving into a networking break until 3:45. And when we come back, we'll be hearing about amplifying hidden women's voices. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.